My husband smiled when his lawyer told the judge I had no home for our daughter. That was the part I remember most. Not the courtroom lights. Not the stack of papers on the table. Not my mother-in-law sitting behind him in a cream-colored suit, looking at me like I had finally been put where I belonged. It was his smile. Small, polite, almost gentle. The kind of smile a man gives when he believes the hard part is already done. His lawyer stood and said, "Your Honor, my client has serious concerns about Ms. Rowe's ability to provide stable housing. At this time, she appears to be unemployed, financially distressed, and temporarily occupying a property she does not own." Behind him, my mother-in-law, Bernice Rowe, leaned toward the woman beside her and whispered loud enough for me to hear. Some women mistake pity for ownership. I did not turn around. My daughter Ava was 9 years old then. She was not in the courtroom, thank God. But her backpack was under my chair because I had packed it that morning with her blue sweater, a granola bar, and the stuffed fox she still pretended she did not need. I looked at that backpack while a stranger told a judge I was unstable. Broke, unfit, living in a house that did not belong to me. Judge Miriam Costello looked down at the file, then back at me. "Ms. Rowe," she said, "do you have documentation regarding your current residence?" My husband's smile widened. His mother folded her hands in her lap. Their lawyer adjusted his tie. They had waited for this moment. They believed I had walked into court with nothing but a tired face and a borrowed black dress. They believed the old blue house on Juniper Lane belonged to my dead mother's estate. They believed I was hiding there because I had nowhere else to go. They believed I had no money, no proof, no leverage, and no one left who would stand beside me. Maybe the old version of me would have let them keep believing it. The version who kept quiet at dinners. The version who let Bernice call me temporary inside my own marriage. The version who paid bills nobody knew about and then stood silent while people called me dependent. But that woman had spent 22 years in the United States Army learning one thing very well. A lie does not become truth because it is spoken with confidence. It only needs one document to start bleeding. I reached into my Navy folder. Not fast, not dramatically. I placed a certified deed on the table, then the county tax records, then the title history. The courtroom got quieter with every page. Judge Costello picked up the deed. My husband stopped smiling. His mother stopped whispering. The judge looked over her glasses and asked one question. "Mr. Rowe, why did your mother attempt to list a house for sale that your wife has owned for 11 years? That was when the room changed. They thought the fight was about custody. They thought the fight was about money. They thought I had come there to beg for time, sympathy, and a place to stay. But by the end of that hearing, the judge would understand the truth. They had not come for my daughter because they were afraid for her. They had come for my daughter because they needed leverage. And for the first time in months, I was ready to show the court exactly why. My name is Natalie Rowe. I was 44 years old when I sat in that courtroom and listened to my husband explain why our daughter would be safer away from me. Before I was Mrs. Rowe, before I was Ava's mother, I was Sergeant First Class Natalie Mercer, United States Army, Criminal Investigation Division. My job was not loud. I did not kick down doors for a living. I followed paper trails, missing money, false claims, forged signatures, property transfers, insurance records. People think documents are boring until one of them saves your life. I learned that a receipt can say what a person refuses to admit. A timestamp can remember what a witness forgets. A signature can betray the hand that made it. That was my work. Observe. Document. Wait until the truth had enough weight to stand on its own. After 22 years, 2 bad falls, and 1 spinal injury that made my left leg go numb when it rained, I retired. Not because I wanted to. Because my body finally filed a complaint my pride could not overrule. I came home to Virginia with a limp I hid well, a pension I did not talk about, and a daughter young enough to still fall asleep with both fists tucked under her chin. I wanted peace. That was all. A kitchen that smelled like toast. A child who felt safe. A marriage where I did not have to be the strongest person in the room every day. When I met Grant Rowe, I thought I had found that. He was polished in a way I was not. Tall, careful, clean hands, easy voice. He worked in commercial real estate development and knew how to make important people feel comfortable. At first, he made me feel comfortable too. He remembered Ava's favorite pancakes. He carried grocery bags without being asked. He asked about my army years, then accepted it when I said there were parts I could not discuss. I thought that was respect. Later, I understood. It was disinterest, dressed as politeness. His mother, Bernice Rowe, disliked me from the first Sunday dinner. She wore pearls, spoke softly, and used manners like a blade. The first time I met her, she looked at my old coat, my flat shoes, and the scar on my wrist. Then she smiled and said, "Grant always did have a habit of rescuing complicated women." Grant laughed. Not because it was funny, because correcting her would have cost him something. I noticed. I always noticed. I just stored the detail and kept moving. That was a habit from my old life. In investigations, you do not react to the first lie. You mark it. You wait. You see what it connects to. Bernice saw a woman with an old car, simple clothes, and a quiet voice. Grant saw a wife who did not make trouble. Both of them mistook privacy for weakness. And for too long, I let them. The first years with Grant were not all bad. That matters, because if they had been cruel from the beginning, leaving would have been easy. He made Ava laugh by burning grilled cheese and calling it smoked cuisine. He brought me coffee when my back locked up. He knew which side of the bed I needed on bad pain nights. There were quiet mornings when I almost believed we had built something ordinary and safe. That is how a lot of damage starts. Not with a door slamming, with a person making you breakfast after they failed to defend you the night before. Bernice's interference came slowly. At first, it sounded like advice. Ava needed better manners. My house needed better furniture. My tone with Grant was too direct. My army habits made the family feel managed. Grant always softened it for her. "Mom means well. You're overreacting. Not everything is a military operation. You always need control." That last one became his favorite. He used it when I asked why our savings account was lower than it should have been. He used it when I asked why Bernice had called Ava's school without telling me. He used it when I asked why he took phone calls in the garage and stopped talking when I opened the door. I did not need control. I needed honesty. But dishonest people love calling clarity control. Bernice had her own habit. She loved sentences that began with, "some women," as if an insult became polite when she pretended it was about women in general. Some women carry military habits into marriage and wonder why nobody feels loved. Some women mistake thrift for dignity. Some women think silence makes them mysterious when it only makes them difficult. She never said my name when she said those things. She never had to. The house on Juniper Lane was the one thing Bernice could never understand. It had been my parents' house. Small, blue. A cracked front step. 2 maple trees. A garage that smelled faintly of motor oil, no matter how many times I cleaned it. My mother had painted little yellow birds along the baseboard in the upstairs bedroom. When Ava was small, she called it the bird room. After my father got sick, the bills came fast. Cancer does that. It eats through savings before it eats through hope. My parents tried to hide the foreclosure notice under a grocery flyer. I found it anyway. I was still active duty then. Grant and I were newly married, and Ava was still young enough that I believed I could protect her from almost anything if I worked hard enough. I paid the arrears. Then I refinanced the remaining mortgage in my name. A real estate attorney handled the transfer. My parents signed the paperwork with shaking hands, and my father made me promise not to tell the extended family. "People get strange around debt," he said. He was right. People also get strange around sacrifice. 11 years before that courtroom, Juniper Lane became mine. Not because I wanted power over my parents, but because I did not want my mother to spend her final years wondering if a bank letter would push her out of her own kitchen. After both of my parents were gone, I kept the house. I paid the taxes, fixed the roof, replaced the water heater, and let Grant keep calling it Natalie's mother's old place, because explaining the truth always seemed more exhausting than silence. I had saved the house. My mistake was letting people believe I had done nothing. Grant started talking about Juniper Lane differently a few months before he moved out. At first, it sounded practical. "The market is strong right now." Then it became sharper. "It's not healthy to cling to dead people's things." Bernice called it, "that little mildew box." And one Sunday at dinner she said, "Some women keep old houses because they cannot build new lives." There it was again. Some women. I looked at Grant. He cut his chicken. That was all. Ava loved Juniper Lane. She loved the yellow birds in the upstairs room, the pantry door where my father had measured my height and then hers, and the maple leaves that turned the front yard gold every fall. When Grant began staying late at work, Ava and I spent more weekends there. Not as an escape, at least not at first. Then, one Thursday afternoon, I received an email from a title company I had never contacted. Subject line: Preliminary Seller Document Request. The company said they were preparing for the potential sale of the property on Juniper Lane and needed confirmation of payoff information, occupancy status, and seller authorization. Seller authorization. I checked the address. My house. Not Grant's. Not Bernice's. Mine. At the bottom of the email, in the reference field, there was a short internal note. GR Development Contact. I did not know what it meant then. Later, Jonah would circle those two letters with a red pen and ask me one question. Isn't your husband's name Grant Rowe? But that afternoon, I only printed the email, saved a digital copy, and put the paper in a folder marked Juniper. I did not call Grant. I did not send an angry message. I made tea and waited for my hands to stop shaking. 2 weeks later, Grant moved out. He did not call it that. He said he needed space. He said Ava was picking up on my anxiety. He said his mother had offered him the guest suite while we reset. I stood in the bedroom doorway while he folded shirts into a leather overnight bag I had bought him for our anniversary. Is there someone else? I asked. He paused. No, he said too quickly. Then he gave me the tired expression he used when he wanted my question to look cruel. Natalie, not everything is an investigation. Ava was downstairs watching cartoons too loudly because children always know when adults are trying to hide the sound of something breaking. The legal envelope arrived on a rainy Monday. Inside was a petition for separation, temporary custody, and exclusive use of the marital rental. Grant wanted primary physical custody. He wanted decision-making authority. He wanted me evaluated. He wanted the court to consider my military-related trauma, my financial instability, and my fixation on a non-marital property in poor condition. He said I had abruptly removed the minor child from the stable marital home and relocated her to a residence associated with maternal family grief. Maternal family grief. That was what they called the kitchen where my mother had fed Ava soup when she had the flu. That was what they called the only place my daughter slept through the night after Grant left. I read the petition twice. Then I placed it beside the title company email. The folder got heavier. Grant and Bernice were careful. Their lie was not wild. It was worse than that. It was believable. I was retired from the Army. I had a service-connected injury. I went to counseling after my last deployment. I was living in my late parents' house. I kept documents. All of that was true. They simply arranged those truths into the shape of a woman a judge could be taught to fear, a traumatized veteran who could not let go, a controlling mother who confused discipline with love, a financially unstable spouse hiding inside grief, a woman who documented everything because she was paranoid, not because people were lying. Bernice understood image better than Grant did. She started showing up at school events with homemade muffins and a sad little smile. She introduced herself as Ava's grandmother on her father's side. She told people I was having a hard season. Not dangerous. Not yet. Just fragile. Fragile is the word people accept before they accept unstable. Grant played the reasonable husband. His texts looked kind if you did not know how to read around them. Natalie, I am worried about your tone. Natalie, my mother is only trying to help. Natalie, please do not turn this into one of your investigations. Natalie, we need to think about what is best for Ava, not your pride. I replied with short sentences and saved everything. Calm made them work harder, because they needed a reaction. A reaction was something they could photograph and hand to a judge, so they created situations. Grant arrived late for pickup, then accused me by text of withholding Ava. Bernice told the school I had forgotten Ava's lunch. Grant claimed Ava was afraid to sleep at Juniper. Each time, I answered with records. Screenshots, emails, a photo of Ava holding the lunchbox she supposedly did not have, a voicemail from Ava telling Grant she wished he could see the fireflies at the blue house. Every lie had a counterweight. Not enough to end it, enough to mark it. Then Bernice made it personal. One evening, Ava walked into the kitchen holding her stuffed fox by one ear. Daddy said Grandma Bernice thinks Juniper is sad, she said. I closed the dishwasher slowly. What do you think? Ava looked around the kitchen at the yellow curtains, the old cabinets, and my mother's chipped mug on the shelf. I think it remembers people, she said. Then her voice got smaller. Grandma said if I say I like it here, Daddy might get in trouble. I knelt in front of her, ignoring the pain in my leg. No, sweetheart, I said. You are not responsible for grown-up trouble. Her eyes filled. Was I bad? Some sentences split a mother cleanly in half. I pulled her into me. No, I said into her hair. You were never bad. That night, after Ava fell asleep, I opened a notebook at my father's old desk. I was done trying to save my marriage. The mission was my child. The lowest point did not happen in court. It happened in a school hallway. Ava's teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, asked if we could speak privately after pickup. She had taught third grade for 28 years, which meant she understood human behavior better than most attorneys. We stood near the classroom door while children's artwork fluttered on the wall. Mrs. Alvarez lowered her voice. Ava has been asking whether mothers can lose houses because they disobey grandmothers. My throat went dry. She said that? Mrs. Alvarez nodded. She also asked if judges punish children for choosing wrong. Through the classroom window, I saw Ava packing her folder slowly, like every object had become heavy. Did she say who told her that? Mrs. Alvarez looked uncomfortable. She said Grandma Bernice told Daddy that judges listen to important families. Important families. That sounded exactly like Bernice. Soft enough to deny. Sharp enough to wound. I thanked Mrs. Alvarez and walked to the car with Ava's hand in mine. I did not question Ava then. Children know when adults are mining them for evidence, and I would not turn my daughter into a witness before I let her be a child. That night, I sat in the hallway outside Ava's room because she had asked me not to go too far. For the first time, I wondered if I was losing. Not because they were right, because they were organized. Money gives lies a better suit. Bernice had contacts. Grant had charm. Their attorney had a voice that made cruelty sound like concern. I had a pension, an old house, a folder, and a little girl who was starting to believe grown-up lies were somehow her fault. So I called Jonah Pierce. Jonah had served with me near the end of my Army career. He had been JAG before he retired, the kind of lawyer who could read a room and a regulation with the same expression. When he answered, I did not say hello. I said, I need help. He was quiet for 1 second. Are you safe? Yes. Is Ava safe? Yes. Then breathe once and start at the beginning. So I did. I told him about Grant, Bernice, the title company email, the petition, the school comments, and the house. All of it. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he said, Natalie, listen carefully. Do not try to convince them. Do not threaten anyone. Do not ask them to admit what they did. I wasn't planning to. You were thinking about it. He was right. Jonah continued. Build the timeline. Save originals. Get certified copies. Ask the school for written observations, not opinions. Pull the county land records. Contact the title company in writing. Then his voice softened. And Natalie? Yeah? Stop underestimating yourself just because they do. That sentence hit harder than I expected. Manipulation does not make you believe the lie all at once. It makes you tired enough to stop correcting it. I looked toward Ava's door. The little nightlight glowed blue against the floor. I need my daughter safe, I said. Then we build it right. Jonah came to Juniper Lane 3 days later with a gray pickup, a cracked windshield, and a box of legal pads. He was 61, broad-shouldered, with a white beard, and the calm of a man who had spent enough years around panic to find it boring. Ava liked him because he asked serious questions about her stuffed fox. What is his area of expertise? Jonah asked. Ava studied him. Night protection. Jonah nodded. Important work. She smiled for the first time that day. After she went upstairs, Jonah and I sat at my father's dining table. He looked around the house without pity. Most people saw age. Jonah saw maintenance. Roof? 3 years old. Windows? 7. Foundation? Inspected last fall. He nodded. They're going to say this house is unsafe. They already have. Then we make it simple, he said. One truth at a time. The first truth was ownership. The deed showed Juniper Lane had been mine for 11 years. The tax records showed I had paid every year. The insurance was current. The house was not a sad little box I was hiding in. It was a stable home, owned free and clear by the mother they were calling unstable. The second truth was money. Grant had told the court I was financially distressed. But my pension, disability payments, consulting income, savings, and Ava's college account told a different story. Then, Jonah found something colder. The joint account had been slowly drained before Grant filed. $7,000 here, $12,000 there. Then a wire transfer to an account connected to Bernice's real estate office. The memo line said, "Staging reimbursement." Staging. For a house I had never agreed to sell. I stared at that line. Jonah turned the page. "Not yet," he said. "What? You're making the face that says you want to call him." "I do." "Don't." So I did not. The third truth was Ava. Mrs. Alvarez gave us a written statement. Not an opinion, just facts. Ava had asked whether mothers could lose houses for disobeying grandmothers. Ava had asked whether judges punish children for choosing wrong. Ava had asked if she was bad for liking her mother's house. I stopped reading there. Jonah waited. He never rushed me when the evidence hurt. Then came the fourth truth. The one that changed the case from manipulation to something much darker. Jonah helped me send a formal request to the title company. We asked for every document connected to the proposed sale of Juniper Lane. 3 days later, the file arrived. Bernice Rowe had opened it. There was a draft purchase offer, a seller disclosure, and a limited power of attorney allegedly signed by me. My name was there, Natalie Rowe. The signature looked like mine, if you had only seen my signature from across a room, but it was not mine. The N was wrong. The pressure was wrong. And most importantly, the date was impossible. I stared at it for a long time. Then Jonah looked at the date and said one word. Hospital. The document was bad. The next one was worse. The power of attorney said I signed at 11:15 in the morning. But at 11:15 that morning, I was unconscious in a VA surgical center. The medical record proved it. I had checked in at 6:12 a.m., gone under sedation by 8:04, and been discharged at 3:37 p.m., with written instructions not to drive, sign legal documents, or make major decisions for 24 hours. Grant knew that. He had driven me there. He had kissed my forehead in pre-op and told me everything would be fine. Then, while I was under sedation, someone tried to use my name to move my house. For a moment, I could not speak. Jonah did not try to soften it. He just slid the next page across the table. The notary log listed my name and address, but the driver's license number was wrong by 2 digits. In the margin, the notary had written one note. Signer accompanied by older woman. Signer appeared rushed. Older woman. Bernice. It was not enough to prove everything, but it was enough to point. Then Grant made his first mistake. He left me a voicemail about Ava's science folder. At first, it sounded ordinary. Then there was muffled movement, and Bernice's voice came through in the background. She will fold once she realizes the house is the only card she has. Grant said something I could not make out. Bernice replied, "Then stop acting guilty. She has no idea what she signed. And even if she questions it, she can't afford to fight us forever." I played it once. Then again. Then I sent it to Jonah. He called me 30 seconds later. "Save the original." I did. "Back it up twice." I did. "That may be the hinge," he said. At first I thought Bernice was behind everything. Cruel. Controlling Bernice. Bernice with her pearls and perfect handwriting, and soft little threats. Then Jonah found something smaller than a confession, but worse for Grant. The county recorder's office had rejected an electronic filing connected to Juniper Lane. It had the wrong legal description and a mismatched owner signature. It had never transferred anything. It did not prove the entire plan by itself. But the payment card attached to the submission belonged to Grant Rowe, not Bernice. Grant. I read his name twice, then a third time. He had known enough to pay for the attempt. That was enough to make the last excuse I had for him go quiet. The camera footage was not perfect either. It was a grainy hallway clip from an old camera I had installed years earlier when my mother started wandering at night. The angle was bad. The audio was useless. But it showed Grant unlocking the front door, Bernice stepping in behind him, 2 people carrying rolled rugs, and a man with a measuring tape. A few minutes later, Ava's bedroom door opened. The yellow bird room. My daughter's room. I could not see everything they did inside. I did not need to. They had entered my house while Ava and I were away. They had prepared it for buyers while telling the court I was unstable. The part that hurt most came later, while Ava and I folded laundry on the living room floor. She was matching socks when she said, "Grandma Bernice said blue houses sell faster if children aren't messy." My hands stopped. I kept my voice normal. When did she say that? When Daddy took pictures. What pictures? In my room. Grandma said not to tell you because you get emotional about old things. I folded one small sock, then another, slowly. Because if I moved too fast, I was afraid my hands would shake. They took pictures in your room? I asked. Ava nodded. Then she looked down at the socks and whispered, "Are we going to lose the blue house?" That was where I merged two fears into one answer. "No," I said. "Promise?" I sat down beside her on the floor. "I promise I will tell the truth about the blue house," I said. "And I promise I will not let grown-ups scare you with things that are not your fault." She leaned against me. "Daddy said court is where people decide who is better." My stomach tightened. "No, baby," I said. "Court is where people are supposed to decide what is true and what keeps children safe." "What if they don't know?" "Then we help them know." She thought about that, then whispered, "Grandma Bernice said you don't have important friends." I looked toward the dining table. The files were stacked there. Not mountains of perfect proof, just enough truth to hold its shape. "She's right about one thing," I said. "I don't have many." Then I kissed the top of her head. "But I have enough." That night, after Ava fell asleep, I sat in her room under the yellow birds my mother had painted. One bird near the closet had a chipped wing. Ava had once asked if we should fix it. My mother had said, "No, baby. Some birds fly with chipped wings." I let myself cry for exactly 5 minutes. Then I got up, printed what mattered, saved what could be verified, and put the file back together. Not perfectly, just honestly. That would have to be enough. By the time the hearing arrived, I had stopped arguing with the version of Grant I wished was real. That was harder than admitting Bernice was cruel. Bernice had always shown me who she was. Grant was different. Grant had held my hand in hospitals. Grant had made Ava laugh over burned grilled cheese. Grant had once kissed my shoulder in the kitchen and told me I made his life feel steady. For months, I kept trying to separate him from what was happening. I told myself he was overwhelmed, pressured, manipulated, too weak to stand up to his mother. But weakness was not the same as innocence. He had not simply looked away. He had helped. The custody hearing was scheduled for June 17th. Temporary orders. That was what the court called it. Temporary custody, temporary support, temporary possession. But every parent who has been through family court knows temporary can become a road if enough people start walking on it. Grant wanted primary custody while the divorce proceeded. He wanted Ava enrolled near Bernice's house. He wanted me to have alternating weekends until I completed a psychological evaluation. He wanted control over major decisions. Most of all, he wanted the court to believe Juniper Lane was not a stable home. Not mine, not safe, not suitable for our daughter. A week before the hearing, Grant's attorney sent over the documents they intended to use against me. Photos of boxes in the Juniper dining room. A screenshot of my VA appointment reminders. A text where I had written, "I need everything documented." A bank statement showing I had withdrawn $15,000 from savings 6 months before separation. A note from Bernice saying I had become increasingly fixated on the old house. Grant thought the $15,000 made me look reckless. He had forgotten what it was for. I had used that money to pay off a private loan he took when one of his development bonuses fell through. He had asked me not to tell Bernice. He said he was embarrassed. I covered him because I believed marriage meant standing under the same roof when weather came. The receipt was in my files. So was the email where he wrote, "I don't know what I'd do without you." I printed it. For a long moment, I just looked at that sentence. Now I knew what he would do without me. He would tell a judge I was broke. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old coffee. Every courthouse does. I wore the black dress. The same one Bernice had seen too many times. Not because I had no other clothes, because it fit. Because I had stopped dressing for people who mistook price tags for proof of worth. Grant wore a navy suit. Bernice wore cream. Of course she did. She looked like a woman attending a charity luncheon, not a hearing where she had helped frighten a child. Grant's attorney, Mr. Leland, was smooth in the way expensive attorneys are smooth. He smiled at me before the hearing began, professionally, as if I were an obstacle with paperwork. Jonah sat beside me and did not smile back. Judge Miriam Costello entered at 9:04. Everyone stood. She was in her late 50s, with gray hair pinned back and the expression of someone who had heard every possible version of adults, claiming to act in a child's best interest. Temporary hearings move quickly. That is what makes them dangerous. People think judges will see everything. Judges can only see what is brought into the room. Mr. Leland stood first. He painted Grant as stable, involved, concerned. He painted Bernice as a supportive grandmother. He painted me as rigid, secretive, financially strained, and emotionally compromised by military trauma and unresolved grief. He did not call me crazy. That would have been too easy. He called me concerning. Concerning is a legal whisper. Then he said I had relocated Ava to a property with unclear ownership and questionable condition. He said I resisted reasonable discussion of selling the property. He said Grant believed I was using the house as an emotional anchor, rather than making rational decisions for our daughter. Bernice watched the judge as if expecting agreement. Grant looked down at his hands at all the right moments. Then Mr. Leland handed up the photos. Boxes in the dining room. The chipped front step. The VA appointment reminder. The old garage. Our concern, he said, is not that Ms. Rowe is a bad mother. It is that she is overwhelmed, isolated, and perhaps unable to distinguish between what she needs emotionally and what the child needs practically. There it was. The kind version of the knife. Judge Costello took notes. Then Jonah stood. He did not begin with outrage. He said, "Your Honor, the respondent agrees that stability is the central issue today. We welcome that discussion." Grant glanced at his attorney. A tiny movement. Not fear. Not yet. Jonah continued, "We will begin with the residents." Mr. Leland stood. "Your Honor, property division is not the purpose of today's temporary custody hearing." Jonah nodded. "Ordinarily, I would agree. However, counsel has made the child's residence central to his custody argument. He has represented that Miss Rowe lacks stable housing and occupies a property without clear authority. That representation is false." The room shifted. Just slightly. Jonah placed the certified deed into evidence. Judge Costello read it. "Ms. Rowe owns the Juniper Lane property?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jonah said. "She has owned it for 11 years. Mr. Leland frowned and turned toward Grant. Grant whispered something. Bernice's posture stiffened. Jonah handed up the tax receipts. "The property is mortgage-free. Taxes are current. Insurance is current. The child has her own bedroom. The school commute is 12 minutes. Mr. Leland stood again. "Your Honor, this is the first we are hearing of this alleged ownership." Jonah looked at him. "Then I am concerned about the diligence behind your filing. Quiet. Clean." The judge glanced at Mr. Leland. "Sit down, counsel. You will have a chance to respond." He sat. Then Jonah introduced Mrs. Alvarez's statement. Ava's anxiety, her questions about losing the house, her fear that liking one parent's home could hurt the other parent. Grant's jaw tightened. Bernice looked away for the first time. Then came the money. My pension. My consulting income. My savings. Ava's college account. The withdrawal used to pay Grant's private loan. Jonah handed up the email from Grant. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Judge Costello read it. Grant's face went red in patches. Some humiliations are earned slowly and received all at once. But the main thing had not arrived yet. Jonah paused, then he said, "Your Honor, we also need to address why the petitioner believed this property might become available for sale." Bernice's head snapped up. Fear appeared on her face for the first time. Small, but real. Mr. Leland stood so fast his chair moved. "Your Honor, again, this is outside the scope." Judge Costello raised one hand. "No," she said. "I want to hear this." Grant's confidence began to drain out of him. Jonah did not repeat the whole investigation. He simply laid out the chain. The title company email. The file opened by Bernice Rowe. The draft purchase offer. The seller disclosure. The grainy hallway footage showing Grant and Bernice entering my house with people carrying rugs and measuring tools. Bernice whispered something to Grant. Judge Costello looked at her. "Mrs. Rowe, you are not a party. You will remain silent." Bernice's mouth closed. I had never seen that happen so quickly. Jonah handed up the limited power of attorney. "My client did not sign this document." Mr. Leland stood. "Your Honor, there has been no finding." Jonah handed up the VA surgical record. "My client could not have signed this document. At the time listed in the notary log, she was under sedation at the VA surgical center." The room went still. Quiet is the absence of noise. Stillness is when everyone understands the next sound matters. Judge Costello read the surgical record, then the notary log, then the power of attorney. She looked at Grant. "Mr. Rowe, did you know your wife was in surgery on this date?" Grant opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "I knew she had a procedure." "A procedure for which you drove her?" His attorney touched his sleeve. Grant swallowed. "Yes." Jonah handed up the rejected electronic filing. "Additionally, Your Honor, a separate filing connected to the property was rejected by the county recorder. It did not transfer ownership, but the payment account used for that filing belonged to Mr. Rowe." Mr. Leland looked at Grant like a man watching a floor open beneath him. Judge Costello read the notice. Then she removed her glasses. That small movement did more to the room than shouting could have. "Mr. Rowe," she said, "did you pay for an attempted filing connected to property owned solely by your wife?" Grant's voice came out thin. "I was told the property situation was complicated." "By whom?" He did not answer. The judge's eyes moved to Bernice. Bernice lifted her chin. "I was trying to help my son and granddaughter move forward." The judge did not blink. "By listing a home you did not own?" Bernice's lips pressed together. Jonah looked at me. I nodded once. He played the voicemail. Grant's voice first. "Ava wants her science folder." Then muffled movement. Then Bernice. "She will fold once she realizes the house is the only card she has." A soft shift moved through the courtroom. The voicemail continued. "Then stop acting guilty. She has no idea what she signed, and even if she questions it, she can't afford to fight us forever." Jonah stopped the recording. No one spoke. Not Bernice. Not Grant. Not Mr. Leland. Not me. Judge Costello looked at the transcript. Then at the two people who had spent months calling me unstable. "Mrs. Rowe," she said slowly, "this court is deeply concerned that a child was exposed to pressure connected to an attempted property transaction, that the respondent's financial condition was misrepresented, and that documents may have been created or used without lawful authority." Bernice tried one last time. "She is very good at making herself look like a victim." The judge turned toward her fully. "No, Mrs. Rowe, what I have in front of me is not a performance. It is a paper trail." That sentence landed harder than any insult. Bernice had trusted tone, clothes, money, a familiar last name. But paper does not care about pearls. It remembers. Then Judge Costello asked for the child advocate's report. It was brief. Ava loved both parents. Ava felt safe with me. Ava became anxious when adults discussed court, housing, or loyalty. Ava reported that Grandma Bernice told her important families win. The judge read that line twice. Then she looked at Grant. "Mr. Rowe, whether you intended it or not, your child has been placed under adult pressure no 9-year-old should carry." Grant's eyes filled. Maybe from shame. Maybe from fear. Maybe because consequences had finally found the right address. He whispered, "I didn't mean for Ava to feel that way. I believed him. That was the painful part. I did not think Grant had set out to hurt our daughter. He had simply wanted to win badly enough that her pain became background noise. That is its own kind of harm." Jonah's final statement was short. "Your Honor, Miss Rowe is not asking the court to punish Mr. Rowe for being afraid of divorce. She is asking the court to protect Ava from manipulation, misrepresentation, and instability created by adults who confused control with care. The allegations against her are not supported by the evidence." "The evidence supports something else entirely." He sat. Judge Costello looked at me. "Ms. Rowe, is there anything you wish to say?" I stood. My knees hurt. My voice did not. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I do not want my daughter taught that love is something she has to prove by choosing sides. I do not want her afraid of houses, judges, or adults with money. I do not need revenge. I need the truth to be stable enough for her to stand on." That was all. I sat down, and for once, no one interrupted the silence. Judge Costello ruled from the bench. Temporary primary physical custody remained with me. Grant received scheduled parenting time, but exchanges would take place through a neutral center for 60 days. Bernice was prohibited from contacting Ava's school, medical providers, or childcare providers. She was also prohibited from discussing litigation, housing, custody, or court with Ava. Grant and I would communicate through a parenting app. A child therapist would be appointed. The property documents would be referred to the appropriate authorities for review. That last sentence made Bernice close her eyes. Not dramatically, just once. A long blink from a woman who finally understood that charm did not work on county records. Judge Costello looked at Grant. Your daughter is not a messenger. She is not leverage. She is not a witness to adult strategy. If this court learns that either side places her in that role again, the consequences will be serious. Then she looked at me. Ms. Rowe, continue to communicate calmly. Continue to follow orders. Do not allow vindication to become escalation. I understand, I said. And I did. Victory can make people careless. I had seen that in investigations. The moment someone thinks the truth has won forever, they stop protecting it. I would not make that mistake. When the hearing ended, Bernice walked out first. Her heels struck the floor too hard. Mr. Leland gathered his papers with stiff movements. Grant stood, but did not move. For 1 second, he looked like the man I married. Not innocent, not forgiven. Just smaller than the story he had been telling about himself. Natalie, he said. I stopped. I didn't think it would go that far. There are apologies that ask you to care more about the speaker's surprise than the harm they caused. This was one of them. I looked at him. You brought our daughter into it. He flinched. I know. No, I said quietly. You're beginning to know. That's different. Then I walked past him. Not because I had nothing else to say, because I had finally learned that not every unfinished thing deserves more of your breath. Outside, the courthouse steps were bright with afternoon sun. I sat on the stone wall, because my leg had started to burn. Jonah handed me a bottle of water. You held up, he said. That your legal opinion? That's my human one. For the first time in months, my hands were steady. The investigation into the forged documents began a few days later. It moved slowly. Real consequences often do. There were interviews, requests, certified copies, a notary review. Bernice's real estate office suspended her access pending inquiry. 2 months later, her name disappeared from the agency website. No announcement, no explanation. Just silence where her perfect smile used to be. For a woman who had built her whole life on being seen in the right rooms by the right people, that silence was not small. It was the first consequence she could not dress up. Grant's attorney withdrew from the property matter. The divorce was not over. Custody was not over. Healing was not over. People think courtroom justice closes a door. It does not. It gives you a lock. You still have to decide what is worth keeping out. A year later, Juniper Lane looked almost the same from the street. That surprised me. After everything that happened, I expected the house to look transformed. Brighter, stronger, marked somehow by what it had survived. But houses are wiser than people. They do not perform recovery, they just keep standing. The maple trees still dropped too many leaves. The garage still smelled like oil when it rained. The back deck still leaned slightly to the left, because my father had built it with confidence, instead of measurements. The yellow birds still flew along the baseboard in Ava's room. One still had a chipped wing. We never fixed it. Ava said it was her favorite. Grant became a better father slowly. Not suddenly. Not in a way that would make a satisfying movie. Slowly. He learned to arrive on time. He learned to speak through the parenting app without adding little cuts. He learned that "my mother thinks" was not a parenting position. He learned to ask Ava questions and survive the answers. Bernice never gave me a real apology. 6 months after the hearing, she sent a letter on cream paper with perfect handwriting. She did not say, "I am sorry I tried to take your house." She did not say, "I am sorry I frightened Ava." She wrote, "I regret that matters became so adversarial." I read it once. Then I placed it in the legal file. Some letters are not apologies, they are exhibits. Ava healed in small ways. She stopped asking if judges punished children. She started sleeping through the night again. One afternoon, she stood against the pantry door and asked me to mark her height below the old pencil lines. My father's marks. Mine. Hers. She pressed her back straight against the wood and tried to make herself taller. I marked the date. Then she turned around and asked, "Does the house know we won?" I thought about that. About my father's bad deck. My mother's lavender. The yellow birds. All the quiet payments. All the years I had let people think I owned nothing because I did not need them to know what I had saved. Yes, I said. I think it does. I used to think strength meant carrying the weight without letting anyone see it. The army taught me discipline, but family taught me something harder. Silence can protect you. Silence can also erase you. I had let Grant believe I was less capable than I was, because correcting him felt exhausting. I had let Bernice call me poor, because I did not want to explain what I had sacrificed. I had let people look at my old car, my simple clothes, my quiet life, and decide I had nothing. That was their arrogance. But letting the lie remain useful to them was mine. The house they tried to sell was already in my name, but the life they tried to define for me was not. That was the part I had to take back. Not with revenge, not with shouting, not by becoming cruel enough to match them. I took it back the way I had always done my best work, carefully, quietly, with proof. And when the time came, I set the truth on the table and let it speak in a room where everyone finally had to listen. If this story touched your heart, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to remember that quiet courage still matters. And if you have ever been underestimated by people who should have known better, remember this: you do not have to burn your life down to prove you were telling the truth. Sometimes all you have to do is keep the records, protect the child, stand in the room, and stop signing your name to the lie.